Hello, welcome back to another episode of In Conversation. Over the last couple of weeks we've been thinking about what is the future going to look like. I hope and pray one day lockdown ends, even if the news sounds like this is life for the rest of it. I'm hoping and praying that one day lockdown will end, and we've been kind of asking the question, when lockdown ends, when we kind of enter into that phase that we all keep talking about called post-COVID, whenever that appears, what will things look like? What will following Jesus look like? What will being a member of the church look like? What will mission look like? And Jess and I were having a conversation earlier. We have had more than one conversation today about buildings. So we thought, actually, as we were kind of talking, we were getting quite excited, or at least I was. So we thought we'd share some of that thinking with you as well, and see what you thought. We don't tend to get a lot of feedback about what we actually say, do we? People tend to say that they really like our conversations, but if you want to challenge what we say, feel free to do so in a kind and loving way. But you were in a presentation this morning, right?
Yeah, so I was listening to somebody present on the theme of buildings and mission, and whether our buildings are used for mission, or indeed whether we should use our buildings for mission. And that kind of got me thinking about the fact that we live in a world that likes to preserve history and tradition, and we were reflecting about when we go out, or when we did used to go out and visit National Trust properties, and we actually went to one in Derbyshire, I think it was, which was known for being preserved in its current state. So it wasn't being upgraded, it wasn't being restored, it was just being cared for in the state that it was in, and I have to admit it wasn't in a very good state. So
they were showing, I think what they were trying to do, their project was to show what happens to a property if it's not looked after, and so they were showing the deterioration of the building. Yeah,
but that kind of got me thinking that it can be really easy for us, can't it, to preserve our buildings as kind of icons of history, of things that have gone in the past. I have three very different church buildings in my parish, two of which are Grade 1 listed, and so require a lot of care and attention.
I've been in those two.
You have. And we're also hoping to rebuild, or at least renew, our third building in Brunnington. And we've just been thinking about what that's going to look like, really, and what the building could be used for. And it just struck me that it's really easy for us to keep everything the same, and to honour the past, and not actually have the building available for use. We had somebody come and visit us prior to shutting our doors again, who told us that it was a shame that we'd got rid of our pews. And even when we said we'd done that because we wanted to create a more flexible space, so we've got a cafe in that particular building, for example, they just couldn't get their heads around why we'd got rid of the pews. They just kept saying, but it was really pretty when, and when we kind of dug a little deeper, we actually found they weren't church members. They didn't even go to church, and yet it somehow mattered to them that our building looked a particular way.
Yeah, so we're National Trust members, and we, as we may have already kind of pointed out, and we like visiting National Trust properties and their parks and gardens. And you watch some of the programmes on TV, and it's not necessarily just National Trust, all sorts of National Trust, all sorts of kind of heritage places, and you'll see they spend thousands and thousands of pounds maintaining old things, and a lot of it very worthwhile. I know those of you that are into fabric and needlework will be shouting at my next comment, but they spend thousands preserving dresses of people from Victorian times and before that to sit in drawers and cupboards to never be seen. Occasionally they get them out to see what the state of their deterioration is, but nobody's allowed to see them because that will damage them. And I kind of sit there and I go, as someone paying membership to go to a property like this, why are we preserving these fabrics if they're not going to be seen or used? And if someone's got an answer, that'd be great. But if something's always sitting in a cupboard, never being used, what is the point in it being preserved?
Yeah.
And I guess that led me to thinking about architecture. And I remember watching an architectural program at one point, and we are pretty much the first generation of people to save buildings. So if you look around the UK at the moment, there are a lot of not just churches, I guess the churches are some of the oldest ones, but there are a lot of public buildings that are kind of coming up to 200 years old now. But you won't find many buildings in their entirety that are older than 200 years. Because up till around the Victorians, when a building was past its sell-by date, or it was falling down, or actually people had no use for it anymore, it was flattened and something else was built in its place. If you think about St Paul's Cathedral, that's actually relatively new because the old one was burnt down. If you think about the Houses of Parliament, which is called the mother of all parliaments, because it's the first place in the world supposedly where democracy and parliamentarianism as we know it was built. It's being rebuilt at the moment because it's coming up, it's 200 years old, say, and it's falling down. And we're the first kind of generation of folk that said, actually, we want to save our old buildings. And I love the fact that we're saving our old buildings, but we have to be saving them for a reason. If you go back to the Roman Empire, if you go back to archaeological digs in Rome and places like that, and I've not been there, as you dig down, you see layers upon layers of different architecture where literally they just knocked whatever was there down and built directly on top of the ruins. And it's a case in point for churches, I think. We can either save our buildings because we want to save them because they're nice buildings, and then preserve them in such a way that those fabric dresses are preserved, that they can't be used and they have to just be looked after because they're falling down. Or we can look to say, well, what of the heritage of the past can we take from the past, and how can we protect it whilst also using it for purposes of the 21st century?
Yeah, and I think I kind of rather ignorantly used to think, why does this matter? Particularly when kind of people don't use our buildings or don't particularly affiliate themselves with our buildings. And yet actually what we've certainly seen where we are in Stockport and Brinnington is that people do have an association with a church, even if they aren't a regular member of it. And if you dare do anything to it, they're the first people to speak up against whatever you want to do. So in Brinnington, for example, our old church building was knocked down before my time, about 3 years ago, I think it was. And they moved into what was then their hall, and that is now a hall and a kind of chapel space in one. And people who would never have darkened the doors were in uproar about it and couldn't face the fact that this kind of community building was going to be knocked down. And so there were then discussions about actually it wasn't going to be knocked down, and the supermarket that is now on that site was just going to move into the church building and create a supermarket inside this church, which I'm slightly intrigued to know what that would have looked like. But actually it was deemed not safe and really in a bad state, so they just flattened it, and now there is this kind of recognisable B&M building. And yet people then weren't prepared to make the shift to the building that we currently have. And yet what we're finding now that we're trying to kind of consult about a new building is those same voices are kind of rearing their heads again, and they feel like they have some sort of ownership over these buildings, even though they aren't necessarily members of the church.
Yeah, I remember doing a mission with Bishop Keith and the Northern Bishops up in Durham, and we went to an old mining town in County Durham, and I was left there. We all went in Bishop Keith's car, and then we were dropped off in different places, and I was left in this town on a Saturday for 5 hours at this particular church, because it was open church. That was what they were doing for their mission, and I was told that someone would pick me up in 5 hours time. And this church didn't have a toilet, and it didn't really have heating, and after 3 hours of sitting in this church, nobody had walked in. So I thought, right, I'm going to find where the people are. Yeah. And I walked up and down the high street and I saw no one. So I walked up and down the high street again, but this time with the curate at that church. And we went into a tattoo parlour, which was quite uncomfortable for me actually. And I just said to the person behind the counter, "Where is everyone?" And he said, "Oh, no one comes to the high street on Saturdays. In fact, no one rarely comes to the high street." And I said, "Well, where are they?" And they're all at the out-of-town shopping centre. And so I found myself kind of a little bit demoralised, very cold. I'd had a couple of cups of tea, so I was kind of wanting to go to the toilet as well. And I found myself back in this church that I knew nobody else was actually going to step inside of for the rest of the day. And I just said to the curate, "What is the point in this building? If people aren't in this community, what is the point in it?" And I just said, "How many do you have come to church?" And I think they kind of said, actually, it was in single figures, maybe 15 was a good day. And I just said, "Well, there's a church 10 minutes up the road. What is the point in this building?" And she said the diocese tried to shut the building down a few years ago. And the whole community were in uproar. And they were in uproar that the church was being closed down because in the church there are something like 5 or 6 miners' lamps in memory of miners who were killed in the pits with a tragic accident one day. And so the church is a memorial to those miners. But it isn't really a place of worship for the wider community because they never go there. And that kind of led me to thinking, certainly when we were talking about this morning, about actually, where is the theology in our building? Where is the theology in how we view our buildings as church? Because I think what lockdown has showed us is actually, I think we're all now signed up. If there was anyone that was a skeptic of the notion that the people are the church, I think we're very much all signed up to that now because we got locked out of our buildings. So what part does our building play in our life as a community? And I think one of the errors we may have made at some point in history, and I'm not saying all churches have made this error, but I think maybe some churches have made the error that the church building is for sacred things only. You can only do God stuff there, which has made it a very alien building to those people who haven't found God yet.
Which we saw a few years ago when that, was it Norwich Cathedral put a helter-skelter, and it was really controversial at the time. But it actually just kind of, a bit less radical than that maybe. I think I may have said it before, but it's been interesting to see how people have kind of set up their worship from home space. And lots of people have set it up to make it look like a living room. And we were having this conversation today about actually our church in Brinnington. One of the things they didn't like about the old building was there was something like 20 of them in a building that could seat 200. And it just felt very dark and cold, and like people were kind of sat miles away from each other. Whereas what they have at the moment is a kind of very intimate chapel space that fits no more than 40.
So like 10 with social distancing.
Well, yeah, we're not even using it with social distancing because it's too small. But actually, and people were kind of commenting on the fact that they actually felt more together because they were physically together. Back in the days when you could, and I think there's something in that for me really about actually our church should feel like home. Our church should be a place that is familiar, that is comfortable to some degree, that is warm, that is welcoming. And I think if we haven't got that, then we just can't expect people to come through the doors, because actually what they see, if indeed they can see anything from the outside, and that's something to think about as well, is very limited, is very dark often. I was saying to this group this morning, we went to one of my churches the other day for me to do something, and Calum and Samuel went into the main body of the church while I was doing something in the vestry. And Samuel stayed very close to Calum. He didn't run off like he does in St Michael's. And part of that is because it will have been dark and cold. But a large part of it is because it's not a familiar space to him, unlike it is here. And there's something in that for me, I think, about how do we make our spaces familiar and comfortable so that people can come as they are.
Yeah, and so you've got that idea of familiarity and an idea of ownership as well. And one of the first major things I did as interim minister at St Michael's, and I guess this might be my longest lasting legacy, is I had all the rhododendrons between the church building and Robin's Lane cut down, and there were all sorts of reasons for it, but I came across the pictures of the rhododendrons that I took the day before they were all cut down the other day, and you couldn't see the church from the main road that hundreds of people pass by every day. And so it had almost been made to disappear, almost like actually this is a private space that we don't want anyone to see. And I don't know if that was part of the thinking or not, but you walk down there now and there's no mistaking that there is a church. Yeah. And I'm very much of the view that it is the church for the people of Bramall and beyond. It's not my church, it's not the people who pay their subs to go there's church, it's everyone's church. And clearing away those bushes was kind of making that statement.
And I think you almost have to work harder in a place like yours where the church isn't in the heart of the community and is actually more out on the edge and doesn't necessarily get a lot of footfall.
Yeah, definitely. But the other comment that I wanted to share about familiarity and comfortableness and ownership was, if you go back to the olden days of monasteries, they had everything they needed for the monks in that one place. Go to, where was that place we went? Fountains Abbey, for example, with all the beautiful water and everything, or any other abbey, Rivu, if that's how I pronounced it correctly, up in Yorkshire. You've got the sacred worship space, but then you've got the education with the library, you've got the living quarters, you've got the kitchen and the dining area, and you've got the places where they did all sorts of work and carpentry, and you've got the hospital, and you've got the care of the sick, and the care of the local population, the places where they made all their mead and beer and whatever, and a few beehives off as well. And so what we can now consider as National Trust or English Heritage members as a completely sacred site had an element where it was completely sacred, where the mysteries of worship were focused completely. But the whole place was also sacred in terms of the activity of the people of God, and yet it was also a secular place as well. And I think actually that's a helpful exercise maybe for churches to be doing as we look to go forwards and say, actually, what does this particular room say about God? But also, what does this particular room say about the people of this day and age right now? Because I can go to some churches and it's very stiff and formal and very well tended and from the 18th century or whatever, and can feel like I'm a complete alien. But I can also go to a church that's got no chairs and you have to sit on the floor, and I kind of go, actually, can we go somewhere else?
Yeah, definitely. And I think we talked about it last week. I think it's actually about almost blurring the lines between what we've been talking about over the last few weeks, really, and kind of reclaiming the church as being at the heart of the community. Something somebody brought up in this meeting today was, do we view our buildings as being something that could be given away? Not in the sense that we're going to put up a for sale sign and literally get rid of it, but actually, do we use our buildings in a way in which other people feel that they too can use it? So, you know, is it a community space as much as it's a kind of church space? Is it an education centre? Is it a shop? Is it, you know, anything you can come up with? Calum's bakery that he loves, whatever it is.
Still had no takers.
How do we view our buildings and how are they used by us and by people in the wider community who perhaps aren't members?
Yeah, and so I guess there's that challenge that where a lot of old mansions and fell into disrepair and ruin and were sold off to the National Trust post World War II because people couldn't afford to keep them, where monasteries were sacked by Henry VIII and his commissioners in England and eventually fell into the hands of the National Trust to maintain their dereliction. Do we want our parish churches to be that in 20, 30, 40 years' time? Yeah. Or do we want to engage with our buildings in a way that says this is a place where God is worshipped, but this is also a place where the people gather in fellowship and in community, and is a place where we can host folk. We talked last week about chaplaincy, and actually we may be needing to be the people who are hosted rather than being the hosts. How can we host people in our buildings that allows us to offer that hospitality that maybe isn't just about worship all the time?
Yeah, and I think we have to ask serious questions about what that looks like, in terms of, actually we do want to honour the past and uphold the tradition, but actually we live in a very different world now, even a very different world from a year ago, and that has to have something to say to us as well.
Yeah, I'm going to finish on this because we've hit 20 minutes, but I had to go and have a conversation with someone yesterday to do with buildings and trees, and I was just walking to this meeting and I just kind of said, where is the gospel in this meeting? And actually I was asking that question of God. Where is that whole call to evangelism and to share the good news of Jesus in this meeting that is actually about boundaries and trees and buildings? And I wasn't quite sure. And thinking about it now, actually the gospel was in how I approached that conversation and how I had that conversation, and the generosity of spirit and the grace that I sought to show in that conversation. But there was nothing particularly gospel focused in that conversation. And that's a real challenge for me. How do we make sure that our buildings and what we have as a church community, whether that's in Brunington trying to build a new church, or Stockport with 2 grade 1 listed buildings which are a nightmare to maintain, or whether it's us here in Bramwell without a listed building but still with a beautiful building that's been cared for, how do we allow the people of our parish and our community to own that building, to use that building, that it then might speak to them of the power, love and grace of God.
Amen.
Amen. Cool. Next week we will have moved into Lent, and Jess mentioned last week that we're going to follow a bit of a series in Lent because we thought that might be a good thing to do. So next week we shall all be in sackcloth and ashes and be appropriately penitent and miserable. I suppose me growing my hair because the barbers are shut is probably enough penitence for Lent this year.
Yeah, maybe we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves this year.
Maybe not. So we will be here again next week with another conversation following a Lenten series, and we'll introduce that a bit. But hopefully these last few weeks have given you a bit of food for thought about what we might be able to do as a church going forward in that post-COVID era, which is hopefully on the horizon. Hopefully. Shouldn't do that, but hopefully. Yeah. Take care. God bless.